Hello, everyone, and welcome to part 3 of our Psychology and Happiness course. Today, we're going to be talking about self-esteem versus self-compassion. So we're going to be comparing and contrasting these concepts a little bit. And then we're going to talk a little bit about optimism and some concepts that relate to that. So before we jump into self-esteem and self-compassion, I just wanted to point out that a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about that relate to these concepts actually comes from Dr. Kristen Neff's research. And she's a psychologist, professor, researcher, and the leading expert on self-compassion. So if after this class you want to learn more about self-compassion, I highly recommend looking up some of her research because it's really breakthrough and really, really interesting. Okay, let's talk about self-esteem. So according to Dr. Neff, self-esteem is an evaluation of our worthiness as individuals, a judgment that we are good, valuable people. So in other words, self-esteem requires us to judge, evaluate, and compare ourselves to determine our worth and value. And over the years, psychologists have increasingly been interested in self-esteem due to its associated benefits, resulting in widespread implementation of self-esteem movements and programs. But unfortunately, this widespread implementation of self-esteem movements and programs have resulted in some unexpected and unintended challenges. And these challenges don't necessarily come from self-esteem itself, but from the judgments, evaluations, and comparisons that we make in an effort to build and maintain our self-esteem that are causing some of these challenges. So let's talk about some of these challenges. So according to research, self-esteem is associated with higher levels of something called the better than average effect. And this is the need to feel superior to others just to feel okay about oneself. So this can result in putting others down and puffing ourselves up to feel superior. Also, it's associated with the self-enhancement bias. And this is believing that we are better than we actually are. And this can sometimes cause us to ignore important parts of ourselves that we maybe could improve on. Okay, so self-esteem is also associated with narcissism, and this is a personality disorder where people have an exaggerated sense of self-importance. Also, it's associated with self-worth that is contingent on our success and people liking us. And this causes our feelings of self-worth to fluctuate with our most recent successes and failures. And according to researchers, this contingency drives people to obsess about the implications of negative events on their self-worth, making them more vulnerable to depression and reduced self-concept clarity, or our beliefs about ourselves and who we are. Okay, and this can also cause us to be overly defensive to criticisms rather than owning up to our mistakes. Because with self-esteem, criticisms can feel threatening to our self-worth. Okay, and the last thing is that self-esteem has been found to be associated with self-criticisms. And according to Dr. Neff, with self-esteem, mistakes and flaws can be perceived by our brains as threats to our self-worth, causing our fight or flight response to kick in and attack these perceived threats through self-criticisms. So self-criticisms are actually a survival response from our brain when our self-worth is so contingent on our successes and being liked by other people. So this is why self-criticisms are highly associated with self-esteem. So research is showing that self-compassion is actually a better way to feel good about ourselves because it does not require judgments, evaluations, or social comparisons like self-esteem does. So specifically, studies show that self-compassion is strongly associated with greater feelings of happiness, optimism, and connectedness. Also, self-compassion is associated with less self-criticisms, depression, anxiety, fear of failure, thought suppression, perfectionism, performance goals, and disordered eating behaviors. Additionally, self-compassion, when compared to self-esteem, also shows more non-contingent and stable feelings of self-worth over time and provides protection against social comparisons. Okay, so this really is breakthrough. We're really finding that self-compassion really is this better way to feel good about ourselves. So now let's talk about what self-compassion really is. So according to Dr. Neff, self-compassion consists of 3 things. So the first is mindfulness, and this is recognizing and being aware of our current experiences in a balanced way that does not ignore or ruminate on the parts of ourselves or our lives that we dislike. Okay, it also consists of self-kindness. So this is being compassionate and understanding towards ourselves. So instead of criticizing ourselves, we accept that we are imperfect. The last thing it consists of is common humanity. So this is recognizing that all people fail, make mistakes, and have flaws. So self-compassion, it recognizes that imperfections and difficult life circumstances are part of the human experience. So we can recognize that we don't ever have to feel alone or isolated in our suffering. And research is finding that this sense of connectedness is a real strength that we can draw on during hard times. Okay, now let's talk about ways we can cultivate self-compassion. So the first way is through practice. So repetition creates changes in our brains by building and strengthening new neural pathways. So the more we practice something, the more it becomes automatic and habitual. So the more we practice self-compassion, the more we will automatically respond to life's ups and downs with self-compassion rather than criticisms. Okay, and there's many wonderful free self-compassion exercises that were created by Dr. Neff and are offered for free on her website. And her website is selfcompassion.org. Okay, so I'm going to go through just a couple of her exercises to give you an idea of what these exercises are like. So the first one is called How Would You Talk to a Friend? So compare how you'd respond to yourself and a friend after a difficult event. Notice and ponder the differences and imagine how things would be different if you responded to yourself the way you'd respond to a friend. Okay, so that's an example of the first exercise found on her website. Another example of an exercise found on her website is something called the self-compassion journal. And this is journaling difficult events throughout the day through a lens of self-compassion. Okay, so I highly recommend going to this website and just browsing through some of those exercises that she has created and offered for free. The next way to cultivate self-compassion is challenging cognitive distortions that cause negative self-talk using the ABCD model. And I want you to hold on to this idea for a moment. So we're actually going to talk more about cognitive distortions and the ABCD model later in this class. So hold on to those thoughts for a moment. Okay, the last way to cultivate self-compassion is through meditation. So research has found that meditation can actually change the structure of our brains in a way that enables us to have more empathy and compassion for ourselves and others. Okay, and there's some wonderful free guided self-compassion meditations that can also be found at selfcompassion.org and Dr. Neff's website. So I highly recommend going and just browsing through the website and looking at all these wonderful free resources. But I also want to note that we're actually going to talk more about meditation in our future classes. So also just hang on to the idea of meditation for a while because we're going to talk more about it and how to do that in future lessons. Okay, let's talk about optimism. So optimism is maintaining hope and faith in the future, even during challenging times. So let's talk about an example that kind of gets us thinking about what optimism really is. So let's talk about Viktor Frankl. So Viktor Frankl was a Jewish psychiatrist who survived Nazi concentration camps during World War II. And after being freed from the concentration camps, he wrote one of my favorite books of all time, and it's called Man's Search for Meaning, where he shares a lot of his experiences that he had while he was in these concentration camps. And according to Frankl, the two types of prisoners who deteriorated were the ones who believed they would be freed by a certain date and those who lost faith in the future. However, the ones who survived and remained resilient were the prisoners who maintained faith in the future. So they believed they would be freed, but they didn't know when. So just think to yourself for a minute, what can we learn about optimism from this? So one thing that we can learn from Frankl's experience is that optimism is the sweet spot on this spectrum, this optimism spectrum. So optimism in the middle makes us resilient, while pessimism on one extreme end of the spectrum and toxic positivity on the other extreme end can sometimes cause problems and challenges in our lives. So for the rest of the lesson, we're going to be talking about these three concepts. So first, we're going to be talking about one extreme of the optimism spectrum, which is toxic positivity. So we're going to talk about what this is, why it's bad for our well-being and health, and how to avoid it. And then we're going to talk about the other extreme end of the spectrum, which is pessimism. So we'll talk about what that is, why optimism is healthier than pessimism, and then how to cultivate more optimism in our lives. Okay, so first, toxic positivity. So this takes thinking positively to the extreme. It involves irrationally ignoring and rejecting negative experiences and emotions. Okay, so signs of toxic positivity include, number one, experiencing feelings of guilt and shame when you feel difficult emotions. Also dismissing other people's difficult feelings and experiences, and hiding painful feelings. Also ignoring your problems instead of facing them. And lastly, reciting positive quotes during challenging times, like just stay positive. Okay, so what are the problems with toxic positivity? Well, one problem is that negative emotions have important functions that we should not avoid. For instance, sadness alerts us that something is not right and motivates us to turn our attention to why that is. Also, anger motivates us to seek mediation. Also, anxiety alerts us of threats and motivates us to seek solutions quickly. Okay, so we don't want to avoid these messages that these negative emotions or these more uncomfortable feeling emotions are sending us. Also, it prevents growth. So facing challenging experiences and emotions allows us to grow and gain greater insights into our experiences. Okay, so we really want to experience this growth. Also, it promotes feelings of shame and guilt rather than feelings of compassion for ourselves and others when painful emotions inevitably arise, right? And we just learned how important self-compassion is. Okay, another problem with toxic positivity is it prevents authenticity. So it leads us to avoid painful feelings rather than dealing with them in a healthy and productive way. Lastly, another problem with toxic positivity is it leads to unrealistic optimism. And this is maintaining an unrealistic belief about the future that is irrationally based. And according to research, unrealistic optimism can lead to demoralization, poorer health, and taking dangerous risks. So let's talk about an example of unrealistic optimism in the real world. So for example, research actually shows that smokers have unrealistic optimism about their health. So they're aware of the dangers of smoking, but they have this unrealistic belief that those risks aren't going to affect them. They might affect other people, but not them. So they stay in their unhealthy habits of smoking. Okay, so that would be an example of unrealistic optimism. Okay, now let's talk about ways to avoid toxic positivity. So the first way is to deal with negative emotions in an honest and compassionate way, because this is necessary to cope with them effectively. So I want you to remember, negative emotions themselves are not bad. It's how we deal with them that matters. So some ways to deal with negative emotions in a positive way include number one, learning to sit with uncomfortable emotions and be mindful of them. So learning to sit and accept these negative emotions ironically decreases their intensity. So we can sit with our uncomfortable emotions by recognizing what emotions we're feeling, so naming them, identifying what triggered them, recognizing what information and signals they're sending us, okay, and responding to them rather than reacting to them. So I also want you to remember, emotions are just emotions, okay, so they don't have to control our behavior. So after exploring the emotion, determine the best way to respond rather than impulsively acting on it. And what I love about this method of sitting with uncomfortable emotions is so often when we feel something uncomfortable, like these negative emotions, we impulsively react on them because they're uncomfortable. But when we can learn to sit with them and kind of be curious about them, it actually creates this buffer in our reaction time. So instead of impulsively reacting to them quickly, right when we feel them, we think about them, we're curious about them, and then we can actually think about more productive ways to respond to them. Okay. And then finally, let these emotions pass without ruminating. Okay. And the problem with rumination is that it increases our brain's stress response circuit, meaning your body gets unnecessarily flooded with the stress hormone cortisol. It's also linked to anxiety, depression, health problems, and harmful coping behaviors like substance use and overeating. Okay, so we want these negative emotions after we've sat with them for a while to pass, and we don't want to try avoid ruminating on them. Okay, another way to deal with negative emotions in a more positive way is practicing self-compassion, which we've already talked about that. So let's look at practicing self-compassion in a way that helps us deal with negative emotions. Okay, so if you remember, self-compassion includes three things. So the first is mindfulness. Okay, so in this context, when we're trying to deal with negative emotions, this would involve being mindful of our negative emotions in a balanced way. So not avoiding them and not getting carried away in them. So what do I mean by not getting carried away in them? So sometimes when we feel something, we automatically assume it's true. For instance, we might feel like a failure because we did not meet our own strict expectations of ourselves, but that doesn't mean we actually are a failure. Hey, the next part is self-compassion, self-kindness. So in this context, that would be showing ourselves understanding and care when we feel negative emotions. So this includes avoiding should statements about our negative emotions, like I should not be feeling angry or I should not be feeling anxious. Okay, so trying to avoid those should statements that can make us feel shameful and guilt about our negative emotions, and instead showing ourselves kindness and understanding. Okay, the third part, common humanity. So in this context, recognizing that negative emotions are part of the human experience. So you never need to feel alone in your negative emotions, right? And like we talked about, this sense of connectedness and not feeling alone is a real strength we can draw on when we're dealing with negative emotions. Okay, the third way to deal with negative emotions in a more productive way is reaching out for social support. And if you remember from past classes, receiving empathy may be one of the best antidotes to emotional pain, and social support has been found to decrease cortisol, the stress hormone. Okay, so reaching out to loved ones really can help alleviate some of that uncomfortable emotional pain that we're feeling. Okay, the fourth way to deal with negative emotions in a more positive way is imagining your best possible self. And I hope you pay attention to this because this is one of my favorites. So, with this practice, try journaling the best possible version of yourself. What is this person like? What do they do? What do they say? What do they value? Okay, then when difficult emotions come up, think to yourself or journal what the best possible version of yourself looks like in this scenario. So, how would they react? What would they say? How would they feel? And what would they do after? And research has shown that this practice is associated with responding more effectively to our negative emotions. Okay, so I love this practice and I hope that you'll try it. Okay, another way to deal with negative emotions in a more positive way is through mindfulness meditation. So, research shows that mindfulness meditation decreases the size of the amygdala. And this is the fear center of our brain. This is actually where our negative thoughts and emotions come from. Now, as we decrease the size of the region of our brain, we decrease its activation. So, as we decrease the size of our amygdala by practicing mindfulness meditation, we'll probably experience less negative thoughts and emotions. Okay, also, mindfulness meditation decreases cortisol, the stress hormone. So, as we decrease feelings of stress, we can deal with stressful situations more effectively and decrease unhelpful negative emotions that arise during these times. Okay, finally, mindfulness meditation increases our awareness of what is going on in our minds at any given moment. So we're more capable of responding to negative emotions rather than automatically reacting to them. And like I mentioned before, we're going to talk more about mindful meditation in future classes. So also hold on to this concept because we'll learn more about it soon. Okay, another way to avoid toxic positivity is having courage. So in situations when the future is uncertain, try to have the courage to accept this uncertainty and maintain hope and faith in the future. Also, in situations when an undesired outcome is completely certain, try to also have the courage to be realistic and cope with it in a healthy way. The question I have for you that I'd like you to ponder is, how often is the future ever really completely certain? So I would argue that this is much more rare than common. For example, Frankel's situation may have seemed to some that an undesired outcome was completely certain because his situation seemed so dire. However, this was not the case because he was eventually freed. So try to remember that even if a situation may seem dire, situations with completely certain undesired outcomes are still more rare than common. So throughout our lives, we're going to be put in many more situations where the future is more uncertain. And in these situations, it is in our best interest to maintain hope and faith in the future. Okay. So now let's talk about pessimism. And this is expecting unfavorable outcomes, thinking negatively, and lacking hope for the future. So now let's talk about why optimism is healthier than pessimism, according to the research. So studies have found that people high in optimism have better moods, more perseverance, are more successful, and experience better physical and mental health than those who are pessimistic. Also, many studies of patients with life-threatening illnesses suggest that those who remain optimistic survive longer. Studies show that optimistic patients are more likely to practice health-promoting habits and seek social support than those who are not. Researchers also believe, although not yet proven, that optimism may have a direct physiological effect that slows down the course of illness, which I think is so interesting and so significant. Okay. Also, optimistic individuals are more likely to engage in active coping strategies that can change or resolve negative situations than those who are pessimistic. Also, optimistic individuals live longer than pessimistic individuals. One study showed that very pessimistic people had a 42% higher rate of death compared to people who were very optimistic. And that's significant. Okay. Also, optimism is associated with lower cortisol levels, even after controlling for other factors. Okay. And in women, optimism has been associated with lower levels of two markers of inflammation that are associated with heart attacks and strokes. And finally, optimism has been associated with improved immune function. Okay, so this is not an exhaustive list of all the benefits that we've seen in research from optimism. These are just some of my favorites. But I hope that what you're taking away from this is that optimism really is healthier and better for our well-being than pessimism. Before we move on, I'd like you to ponder this question for a moment. Do you sometimes find it difficult to think optimistically? So if you answered yes, that makes sense, because there are many scientific reasons that explain why pessimism can feel easier than optimism many times. So the first reason for this is something called the negativity bias. So although most of our experiences throughout our life are positive, our brains have evolved to focus on negative experiences because these experiences are the ones that can typically threaten our lives and well-being, and our brains are all about focusing on our survival. So we tend to exaggerate the negative and overlook the positive in our lives. Okay, the second reason why pessimism can feel easier is because of negative past experiences. So much as our bodies are built from the foods we eat, our minds are built from the experiences we have. So negative experiences in our past can create distorted core beliefs about ourselves and the world we live in that can cause us to habitually think pessimistically. Okay. Another reason why pessimism can sometimes feel easier than optimism is because of something called cognitive distortions. And these are biased perspectives we take on ourselves and the world around us. So they are irrational thoughts and beliefs that we unknowingly reinforce over time. Okay, and as you can see on your screen, these are a list of 11 common cognitive distortions identified by psychiatrist, researcher, and cognitive distortion expert, Dr. David Burns. Okay, and every once in a while, we all give into cognitive distortions. So I just wanted to take a moment to go through some of these 11 common distortions. So let's talk about the first one, all or nothing thinking, which is also known as black and white thinking. So this is seeing things in terms of extremes. So for example, something is either fantastic or awful, or you believe you are either perfect or a total failure. Okay, the next one is overgeneralizing. So taking one instance or example and generalizing it to an overall pattern. So for example, receiving a C on a math test and concluding that you are stupid and failure. Okay, the next one is mental filter. So focusing on a single negative piece of information and excluding all positive ones. Okay, so for example, thinking I made a mistake on that report at work, and now everyone will realize I'm not up to the job, and ignoring all the good work that you have done at your job. Okay, the next one is disqualifying the positive. So this distortion acknowledges positive experiences, but rejects them instead of embracing them. So for instance, thinking I only did well on that test because it was easy. Okay, the next distortion is jumping to conclusions, mind reading. So this manifests as the inaccurate belief that we know what another person is thinking. So for example, thinking my friend hasn't replied to my text, so I must have done something to make her angry with me. Okay, the next distortion is jumping to conclusions, fortune telling. So this is the tendency to make conclusions and predictions based on little to no evidence and holding them as gospel truths. So for example, a young single woman predicting that she will never find love or have a committed and happy relationship based only on the fact that she has not found it yet. There is simply no way for her to know how her life will turn out, but she sees this prediction as fact rather than one of several possible outcomes. Okay. The next one is magnification, catastrophizing, or minimization. So this involves exaggerating or minimizing the meaning, importance, or likelihood of things. So for example, an athlete who is generally a good player but makes a mistake may magnify the importance of that mistake and believe that he is a terrible teammate, while another athlete who wins a coveted award in her sport may minimize the importance of the award and continue believing that she is only a mediocre player. Okay, the next one is emotional reasoning, and we kind of touched on this briefly. So this distortion refers to the acceptance of one's emotions as fact. So it can be described as, I feel it, therefore it must be true. But just because we feel something doesn't mean it's true. So for example, I feel like a failure, so I must be a failure. Okay, that would be an example of that distortion. Okay, the next one is should statements. And we also kind of briefly touched on these ones. So these are statements that you make to yourself about what you should do. They can also be applied to others, imposing a set of expectations that will likely not be met. When we hang on too tightly to our should statements about ourselves, the result is often guilt that we cannot live up to them. When we cling to our should statements about others, we are generally disappointed by their failure to meet our expectations, leading to anger and resentment. Okay, the next cognitive distortion is labeling and mislabeling. So these tendencies are basically extreme forms of overgeneralization in which we assign judgments of value to ourselves or to others based on one instance or experience. So for example, a student who labels herself as an utter fool for failing an assignment is engaging in this distortion, as is the waiter who labels a customer as a grumpy old miser if he fails to thank the waiter for bringing his food. So mislabeling refers to the application of highly emotional, loaded, and inaccurate or unreasonable language when labeling. Okay, the last one we're going to talk about is personalization. So this involves taking everything personally or assigning blame to yourself without any logical reason to believe you are to blame. And this distortion covers a wide range of situations, from assuming you are the reason a friend did not enjoy the girls' night out to the more severe examples of believing that you are the cause of every instance of moodiness or irritation in those around you. Okay, so those are just kind of some brief walkthroughs of those 11 common cognitive distortions. So now let's talk about replacing pessimism with optimism. So one way to do this is challenging the negativity bias. So remember, because of the negativity bias, which is our brain's tendency to focus on the negative and ignore the positive, it takes an active effort to notice and internalize positive experiences. So we can challenge this bias by doing the taking in the good exercise. The taking in the good exercise was created by Dr. Rick Hanson. He's a psychologist, a leading expert in positive neuroplasticity, also known as positive brain change, a senior fellow at UC Berkeley, an author, and has lectured at Oxford, NASA, and Harvard. Okay, so he's a very respectable psychologist in the world of psychology. Let me explain the science a little bit behind this exercise so you can understand a little bit of why it works. So if we practice taking in the good every day, multiple times a day, we create and strengthen new neural pathways that make noticing the positive more automatic and habitual. So this can change our brain's tendency to focus on the negative to focusing on the positive. Okay, now let's talk about how to do this exercise. And there's 3 steps. So the first one is to bring mindful awareness to positive experiences. And it doesn't have to be anything big. So for example, noticing an admirable quality about ourselves, the sunset, or an act of kindness by another. So something just small, it doesn't have to be big. The second step is savor the experience. So instead of giving into the tendency of letting our attention skitter off from the positive experience, try to stay with it for about 20 seconds or so. The longer we hold the positive experience in our attention, the stronger it will imprint in our memory and build new and stronger neural pathways that make recognizing the positive more automatic and habitual. Also, relax your body and absorb the thoughts, emotions, and physical sensations of the experience. So for example, if someone does something kind to you, let the feelings of being cared for bring warmth to your whole chest and spread throughout your whole body. Okay, also pay attention to the rewarding aspects of the experience. So for example, how good it feels to receive a hug from a loved one. Focusing on the rewards of an experience increases dopamine release, which helps the experience feel more emotionally stimulating. And the more emotionally stimulating it is, the more it will also imprint in our memory and build new neural pathways that make recognizing the positive more automatic and habitual. Okay, finally, the third step, imagine or feel that the experience is sinking deep into you. So keep relaxing your body and absorbing all the aspects of the experience, like the thoughts, emotions, and bodily sensations. Okay. The next way we can cultivate more optimism is healing past negative experiences. Because of the negativity bias, our brains tend to hold on to painful experiences, so it takes effort to heal them. And we can heal past negative experiences by number one, seeking professional counseling to help us work through the painful emotions associated with our painful experiences. And number two, doing a practice that uses opposite positive experiences when the memories of negative experiences come to mind. And this daily practice is also recommended by Dr. Rick Hansen. So let me explain the science of this practice a little bit. When we have negative experiences, our brain stores these memories with their associated negative emotions. So when these painful memories are activated, it also brings those associated negative emotions with it. So we can bring down the negative emotional charge of the memory, by bringing to mind opposite positive experiences every time the memory is activated to create new emotional associations with the painful memory. So let's use an example to explain this practice. So for example, if you keep experiencing sadness as a result of mistreatment from a past relationship, recall being loved by other people in your life and allow those feelings to sink in. Say to yourself, I got through that. I am still here, and many people love me. And let the feelings of being cared for and loved sink into you. So this practice does not take away the memory of what happened, but its emotional charge or that strong feeling of sadness associated with the memory will steadily decline over time as we create new associations with these painful memories. Okay. The next way we can cultivate more optimism is using the ABCDE model. Remember, I mentioned earlier in this class that the ABCDE model is also recommended to use to cultivate self-compassion. So we can challenge distorted beliefs about ourselves and our lives by using this model. And it was created by psychologist, researcher, author, and positive psychology leading expert, Dr. Martin Seligman. Okay, so when distorted thoughts and beliefs about ourselves and our lives come up, let's use this model. So first, let's start with the first letter A. So A stands for adversity. So what was the event that triggered the pessimistic thought or cognitive distortion? Okay, next is B. B stands for belief. So what was the automatic distorted belief or cognitive distortion you had when the event occurred? Okay, C stands for consequences. So what are the emotional and behavior consequences of this belief? Okay, now D. Now pay attention to D because D is the most important part. D stands for dispute. So is the thought or belief factually correct? Is there evidence to back up the belief? Is the belief useful? Could the thought or belief possibly be a cognitive distortion? If the thought or belief is factually correct, is it useful? So in other words, does it contribute to helpful or unhelpful emotions and behaviors? If it contributes to unhealthy emotions and behaviors, maybe try letting it go and not giving it so much power. Okay, then the last letter, E. So E stands for energizing. So recognize how much better you feel after you successfully dispute your routine belief. And I actually created a worksheet of this ABCDE model that you can download and actually start practicing using this model so that you can get better at it and start improving some of those pessimistic beliefs, okay? Let's talk for a moment about an example of using the ABCDE model in the real world so that you can really know how to use it when things come up in your life. Okay, so for example, let's start with A, adversity. So my husband and I went out on our first date since our baby was born and we bickered the whole time. Okay, now B, the belief. What is wrong with us? We finally have alone time and we're just bickering. Lots of articles say that marriages can end after the birth of a baby, and maybe we are headed in that direction. Okay, C, the consequences. I felt deep sadness and panic. I could not even eat my food. My husband was trying to shift the mood, but I couldn't even look at him. Okay, D, dispute, the most important part. Maybe my expectations are unrealistic. It is hard to feel romantic with the little sleep we both got because of the new baby. Maybe these thoughts are just catastrophizing and jumping to conclusion distortions. One bad dinner does not mean divorce. This was a good first try at romance since our baby was born, and maybe our next dinner will go better. Okay, now E, energizing. I started to feel better and focused on my husband. We decided to view this as a practice dinner and that we would try again next week. After talking about it, we felt more connected. Okay, so I hope after going through a real life example of using this ABCDE model, this kind of helps you understand a little bit better of how to use it. Okay. Okay, the fourth way we can cultivate more optimism in life is meeting with a mental health professional to receive cognitive behavioral therapy treatment, otherwise known as CBT. So CBT is a type of psychotherapeutic treatment that helps people learn to change unproductive thought patterns that have a negative influence on their emotions and behavior to more productive ones. So this type of therapy is a great intervention therapists use to help us shift pessimistic thinking to more optimistic thinking. Okay. And finally, the last way we can cultivate more optimism is increasing gratitude. So practicing gratitude has been shown to effectively increase optimism because having gratitude for the past increases our hope for the future. Okay, and a few gratitude practices that we can do include a daily gratitude journals, expressing gratitude daily to loved ones verbally or through a note, a gratitude prayer, so expressing gratitude to a higher power or the universe daily, and guided gratitude meditations. Okay, so some other benefits of gratitude according to studies include increased happiness, reduced cortisol, the stress hormone, resulting in better cardiovascular health and increased emotional resiliency, reduced feelings of pain, improved sleep quality, and improved relationships. And so gratitude is this really awesome practice that not only can increase optimism in our lives, but can also do all these other things to improve our happiness and well-being. Okay? So in summary, self-compassion is a more effective and stable way to build and maintain our self-worth that also avoids social comparisons and self-evaluations. Self-compassion includes mindfulness, self-kindness, and common humanity. And we can build self-compassion through daily practice, challenging cognitive distortions with the ABCDE model, and guided meditations. Also, a healthy dose of optimism can improve our mental and physical health. We can avoid toxic positivity by having the courage to accept the uncertainty or inevitable reality of a situation and learning to cope with these situations effectively. Also, we can avoid toxic positivity by dealing with negative emotions in an honest, accepting, and healthy way. And some ways to do this include sitting with it, so sitting with our uncomfortable emotions, practicing self-compassion, seeking social support, and imagining your best possible self. Also, challenges of optimism include the negativity bias, past negative experiences that can create distorted beliefs, and cognitive distortions. Okay, and we went through all 11 of these common cognitive distortions. Okay, increasing optimism includes challenging the negativity bias by practicing taking in the good every day, healing past negative experiences through one, seeking therapy, and bringing opposite positive experiences into our awareness when these experiences come up in our memory. Also using the ABCD model to challenge distorted pessimistic beliefs that can also help us increase some optimism in our lives. Also seeking therapy and practicing gratitude. Okay, and I just want to comment that although these are more general concepts that have been scientifically proven to increase our happiness and well-being, I also recommend reaching out to a therapist because therapy can provide us with that more individualized help that could really help us with our specific circumstances and life challenges. So if you're finding that you're doing all of these things that are recommended in these classes and your happiness and well-being still isn't being improved, I highly recommend reaching out to one of our therapists. And you can be connected with one of our therapists by calling and connecting to this number found at the bottom of the screen. Okay, looking ahead, next time we're going to be talking about diet and happiness, improving our relationship with food, and the brain building power of exercise. Okay, so this will be another wonderful class that will give you some additional tools to increase your happiness and well-being. So I hope to see you there. Thank you so much for joining me today. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. And I hope to see you next time in our next class.